Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Donovan, and today I want to give you an overview of the Irish in the 1921 census. So I'll get uh, my presentation up here so you can all have a look. Um, Now, I'm going to probably remove myself from the screen because I think it actually makes it easier for you to follow. But if you have any complaints about that, please do let us know on the chat box, the comments. But I think that's a little bit easier. Okay. First of all, who am I? Well, I work as a strategic initiatives manager in Findmypast, and that means basically I look after things like our partnerships and our business to business work and so on, all fairly dull and dry. But I also have the privilege of looking after our Irish licensing, and I work as our Irish records expert, and I've been doing this for quite a long time now. I also look after our Catholic and nonconformist records for Europe. And my background is as an historian. I've been qualified back in, well, a long time ago now, and was a university lecturer for a while before I started working in Find My Past. So today, I want to talk about the Irish in the 1921 census. And this is broadly speaking the structure I'm going to follow. We're going to look at what about the 1921 census of Ireland, because of course there isn't one. We'll find out why. So I'm going to explain to you what Irish I'm talking about and what the Irish population in England and Wales looks like, and go into some details there. I'm going to finish up by actually looking at how you can get the best out of using the 1921 census on Find My Past. Um, let's start with what about the 1921 census for Ireland? Because, of course, there was one for England and Wales. There was one for Scotland, which we'll probably see come online sometime later this year. And there was also one supposed to happen for Ireland. So why isn't there one? Well, there's a bit of trouble going on then in Ireland. These images will give you some clue. Um, what's happening? We were fighting what we call the War of Independence in Ireland. Um, and this was essentially a military engagement between large sections of the Irish population and the British establishment to ensure Ireland became an independent country. And of course, at the time the census is taken, or in England and Wales and in Scotland, it simply wasn't possible to take a census in Ireland. And in fact, um, it was only the resolution to this conflict only happened towards the end of 1921, in December, following the treaty, when the British Army pulled out of the country. But quite a lot of work was done towards having a 1921 census of Ireland, and our good friend Audrey Collins in the National Archives has shared with us examples of what the actual forms look like, because they printed them, got ready to do the census in Ireland. It's such a shame it never happened. But it was followed through 5 years later by a census in Ireland in 1926. But don't ask me when and where it'll be released, because that really is a true Irish mystery. So, what Irish am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the Irish that were born in England and Wales in 1921. So, the Irish born, I should say, they were actually living in England and Wales. Now, here's a map of Ireland. Just want to absolutely clarify we know what we're talking about. The population of England and Wales in 1921 is almost 38 million people. And the number of people who are born in Ireland who are living in that area is 364,000. Almost 1% of the population was born in Ireland. Of course, there's many more who were the children of Irish-born parents and so on, sort of first generation, second generation Irish, but they're not recorded, or certainly their Irish ethnicity is not recorded in the census. The split between North and South is interesting as well, because 18% of those who record their place of birth as Ireland are from the new state of Northern Ireland. Because in 1920, there had been a Government of Ireland Act passed in the Westminster Parliament, which created two new dominions in Ireland. It created two countries which had their own parliament. And one was Northern Ireland, which are the six counties which are shaded in orange on your map here. They're part of the province of Ulster. The three remaining counties in Ulster, the one that's green on the map, went with the new state of Southern Ireland. Now, Southern Ireland never came into existence. Northern Ireland had its first parliament in 1922, and it went on to become, it's still there today. Southern Ireland never had an election to its parliament, or it never came into being as an entity. And in fact, it was replaced following the treaty by a new dominion called the Irish Free State, Siúrstad Éireann in the Irish language, which of course renamed itself as the Republic of Ireland in 1949. In 1921, 18% of those who said they were born in Ireland came from what is now Northern Ireland, and 77% came from what is now the Republic of Ireland. And this is slightly different than the actual proportion between these two areas in the 1926 census of Ireland. As you can see, in the 1926 census, there was a disproportionate number of people in Northern Ireland. It had a greater industrialization, greater urbanization. So what do these Irish who were Irish born who are in England and Wales, what do they look like? Well, let's have a look and see what we can learn. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers by you, but always remember that generalizations always hide the specifics of your family history. And genealogists delve into microhistory all the time and the specifics. And those specifics rarely conform to the generalizations of social history. But that context, I think, is really useful because you can get a sense of how similar are your ancestors or not. So, the Irish born in England and Wales in 1921. Well, we can look at them across an age profile. And if you look across the age profile, it looks fairly consistent across every decade of people's lives. So it can give you the impression that migratory patterns have been pretty consistent. That's not the case, as we'll find out very soon. In fact, actually, it's pretty much what you would imagine you'd find if you looked at any population here. The one thing that's unusual about the Irish is that those women who are widowed, recorded as being widowed, um, there's a really high proportion of women who have lost their spouse as opposed to men. It's a 7-to-3 ratio, which is unusual compared to the rest of the population. Now, with migration, as I said, you get the impression it's been consistent, but it hasn't been. What's interesting about 1921 is it actually records a low point in migration from Ireland into England and Wales. It had reached a peak in 1861, where 3% of the population were born in Ireland. And by 1921, it's slightly less than 1%. Now, the reason for that is because Britain had been replaced by America because of affordable travel and better prospects. And so from the 1880s onwards, you see the bulk of Irish migrants going to America. But this was to change. After 1921, this changed, and partially because the Americans brought in tighter immigration regulations, but also because there was a growing need for immigration from Ireland for the industrial heartland in the UK. So you see Irish migration increasing dramatically after 1921, right up to the 1950s and 1960s. And where were they from, the Irish? Well, it's no surprise again. They came from the biggest urbanized areas of the country. Number one is Dublin, then Cork, then County Down up in Northern Ireland, Mayo out the west, Antrim again up in Northern Ireland, Tipperary down the southwest, Galway out in the west of Ireland, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, where the largest groups of Irish were settled anyway. It's no surprise. And where were they living in England and Wales? Again, some of you won't find this too surprising, but the number one county was Lancashire. Um, and thereafter, London, very large quantity there. In Middlesex, which of course you could argue is pretty much London anyway. Yorkshire, Surrey, Kent, Cheshire, Hampshire, Glamorgan, Durham. But if you go through the counties and you look at the ones with the highest concentrations of Irish you can see this list here, the numbers of Irish born per 10,000 of the population. The areas which are the most Irish, like in London, you'll see that it's a very high proportion are Irish women, like Surrey and East Sussex. And these are most likely women who are in service because that was one of the big drivers for women to migrate into England and Wales. Or in Dorset, you can see it's mostly men, just like in Yorkshire, again, coal mining. Um, and similar heavy industry like that was actually bringing men in. Again, the same is true in Glamorgan and Northumberland. We get even more clarity on the reasons for migration if we look at this at the level of towns. And the towns with the highest concentration of Irish per 10,000 of the population Bootle, Liverpool, Birkenhead, Wallesley, St Helens, they're all in Merseyside, with Barrow and Furness really close by. And this is coal and shipbuilding and shipping and steel country. I mean, remember, Liverpool was the New York of Britain. I mean, it was a great opportunity for people migrating there for work. And of course, Ireland was an economic basket case for so much of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Young men, particularly, and young women too, particularly from agricultural areas, they would immediately look for the opportunities which were always in Britain or in America. Then you look further down, Salford and Manchester at the heart of the textile factories. So again, that's bringing in the workforce, which is equally men and women from Ireland and also from Scotland, I should add. But again, I'm focusing on Ireland here. Plymouth down in Devon was the home of the Royal Navy, shipbuilding and shipping. Um, Merthyr Tydfil, and apologies for my pronunciation, my Welsh pronunciation isn't brilliant, and Middlesbrough were coal country. Again, the former is steel and the latter iron. Again, these are the sort of places you would expect to find migrants of young workers looking for prospects. But always remember when we look at this, we're only looking at those born in Ireland. We're not looking at first and second generation Irish in these figures, which would, of course, accentuate these numbers we're looking at. So let's have a look at a few examples of the Irish in England and Wales. I'm going to start with the best known Irishman in England and Wales in 1921, by far the best known, George Bernard Shaw. He was famous, arguably infamous already at this point. He's often considered the most important dramatist and cultural influence since Shakespeare. I'm not entirely sure about that. I think he probably felt that as much as anybody else. But he was certainly a fine polemicist, an astute observer of human behavior, a contrarian, and a raconteur. He was also Irish, and he was born in Dublin, as was Charlotte Francis, his wife. She was born in Cork. Let's have a look at their return in more detail to see what we can learn. Now, this is the familiar left-hand side of a census return, the names, the relationship to the head of household, the ages. Of course, this is different in 1921 because we get years and months, which is brilliant. You also get their sex, their marital status, and their place of birth. Place of birth, again, really important because when they were born in England and Wales, they gave their county and place. When they were not born in England and Wales, they gave country and the county. And you can see in there George Bernard Shaw writes that he's born in Ireland and that he's born in the county of Dublin. His wife, on the other hand, Charlotte, she filters in wrong. And it's great that she did because she filtered in following the English model of county and place. So we have County Cork is where she's born, and it's in Rosscarbery, which is in the West Cork. Now, you'll also notice here the code 15X. Now, the 1921 census is covered in codes. It was one of the most striking features of the census is how determined the bureaucrats who are working with it were to track everything precisely, and they use codes to do it. 15X is the code they use for what they called Southern Ireland, and we'll see what they called other countries in a moment. Now, this is the right-hand side of the form, and this is where all the new stuff appears, the stuff that's pretty much unfamiliar from previous censuses. It includes occupation, of course, but it also gives the details of the employer and the place of work in these new fields that exist there, as well as the number of dependents. Once again, note the codes that are being used throughout this. It's really important. Those codes are great because we've given you, they can really help you read this if you find difficulty in actually reading the handwriting. And we have ways to do that. And I'll tell you about that a little bit later on in this talk. Back over on the left-hand side of the page, I want to draw your attention to this little box in the bottom left-hand corner, because this appears in every census return, and it gave the number of males, females, and persons in a house, but also the number of rooms, so you can get an idea of how affluent the family were who were living there. In this case, they had 10 rooms, and this number of rooms doesn't include bathrooms, or of which most people didn't have one inside the house anyway at this point, or kitchens. It just simply was as bedrooms and living rooms. So this is an affluent house. George Bernard Shaw, no surprise, he was very successful. Another very famous Irishman is William Butler Yeats, and he was living in England at the time, and he's recorded staying at a cottage in Shillingford in Berkshire with his wife George. George was 28 years and 8 months. I mean, W. Yeats at this point was 56, so she's quite a lot younger than him. And they're recorded with their young daughter, Anne, who's 2 years and 4 months. I met her a number of times in my youth. She was quite a character, brilliant painter in her own right, but it's extraordinary to actually come across her here. And again, you'll see the codes being used for where they're born, 15x. Um, Another famous Irish woman who probably isn't as immediately familiar to most of you, even though she was internationally acclaimed in France and Britain and America. This is Rita Kelly, Margaret Kelly. And here she's recorded in the census as a 9-year-old. She's an adopted daughter of Mary Murphy. They're both born in Dublin. They're both living in Liverpool on 48 Daysbrook Lane. They've only got 3 rooms in their house. Rita's adoptive mother worked in domestic service for a hospital, and they were obviously very poor. Now, I know from, because I know who this person is, I know that Rita had very poor health, partially as a consequence of the environment she grew up in. And so her doctor advised her to dance. She also had striking blue eyes, so her adopted mother called her Bluebell. Of course, she's Miss Bluebell. She joined a Scottish dancing troupe in 1924. Then she went off to Paris and she became a dancer and a choreographer for the famous Folie Bergère, where she founded the Bluebell Girls. She married the pianist in the Folie Bergère, who was a Romanian Jew. So when the Germans invaded, she was immediately involved with the resistance. She was imprisoned. She got out, but she worked tirelessly to aid the city's Jews and all her fellow resistance fighters. And she was honoured after the war with an OBE from Britain and by a Chevalier of the Legion of Honour from the French. Um, but, I'm much more interested when I look at the census in ordinary people, not those who became famous afterwards, because most of us are looking for ordinary people in the census. And the bulk of the Irish in England and Wales worked in physical labour of one sort or another. There'd always been a steady stream of Irish men looking for work, and farm work was one of the options. It wasn't the first choice for many. I mean, they were coming from Ireland, where farm work was the only job available in most parts of the country. But it was still something which was heavily populated by our Irish men, mostly, rather than women. And you will find them extensively across the census. Here's an example of one to give you an idea of the life that could be led by these migrant workforce on the farms. This is a extraordinary return from New Cottages Field in Northfleet in Kent. It's a field. It's not a house, it's a field. And it includes several Irish, like Elizabeth Bush. She's there in the bottom of your screen. She's age 40 and she's born in Clonmel in Ireland. Look at the number of rooms. There are none. That's because they're living in a field. These are vagrants, all of them. And they're making a living basically on the side of the road, hoping to actually get work. For most young women coming from Ireland, domestic service was the easiest form of employment, the best way you could actually make a life. And that's certainly what they tended to focus on, trying to actually see what they could find. Let's have a look at some examples. Okay, here's an example of some St. Mary's Retreat in Union Street in Carmarthen. It's in Carmarthenshire in Wales. It's a household of Catholic priests. They've got 2 servants, both of whom are from Ireland. One from Northern Ireland, and again, they've got a 14X beside their name. It's the very last entrance from Francis Hard. And then the other from the south. So you can see the place of birth there and the codes. And you can see the employment codes. Now, that's really important. These employment codes are very, very detailed. They went to enormous trouble to ensure that they were accurately recording these employment codes properly. And of course, you've got some great utilities to help you read these should you have a problem. So this is a very typical environment. For men, again, as I said before, it was coal, iron, steel. It's the heavy industry which is dragging them all across to Britain. I'll show you a couple of examples. This is the household of George Boyd. He's 51. He's married, and he was born in Ballynahinch in County Down, now in Northern Ireland. He's a coal miner, a stone man, and he's living in Ashington in Northumberland. Now, you'll see there in his entry, it says he's on strike, he's out of work. But under the terms of the census, he still had to write in where he had formerly had his job or where he was on strike from, which is, of course, Ashington Colliery. And these strikes, these industrial unrest, and also the numbers of people who are out of work is one of the key reasons why the census was delayed from April till June. So that gives you an idea. It becomes a major point of contention because, of course, the government in England and Wales is trying to build the land fit for heroes, and so many people were still out of work. Here's another example. It's from 43 D Street in Jarrow in Durham in England. And in that house, we have James Downey, who's 31. He's born in Limerick with his wife Mary. Mary has her 3 children from a former marriage. You'll notice by the children, by their names under their marriage or orphanage column, it basically says their father is dead. James Downey's brother John is also living in the house, and James works as a blast furnace worker. He's out of work, and his brother is a shipyard labourer, also out of work. You can see I've just zoomed in there in the bottom of this comment. This was such a common feature of the industrial workforce of Britain. Of course, the Irish you also find in the prisons as well. I mean, they make up a disproportionate number of prisoners, 6% of the prison population, less than 1% of the total population. Again, we shouldn't be quite so surprised by that. They're often arriving in very poor circumstances. All sorts of opportunities on the wrong side of the tracks would have come in front of them. I want to finish by showing some tips about doing search. I mean, these are not fundamentally specific to doing Irish research. I mean, you can use this for anybody, but I think it's important just to remind you about ways you can minimize the problems you might have in carrying out research in the 1921 census. You'll have gone to the advanced search screen, I'm sure, if you've tried this before, and we transcribed an awful lot of fields, which is brilliant if you're doing precise research, and it's really handy and it's really useful. But it can be very intimidating to start with. So I would always advocate that you should start your search broad and then narrow down. Don't fill in too many details. Like, for example, here we've just got a name and nothing more than that. We've only got 4 results, so you're already down to a fairly small number. So don't try and zoom down to a fine detail too early. But when you decide to do so, of course, if you're looking for the Irish, the very first thing you're going to do is choose the birth country. And the birth country, you'll see people who are born all over the world who are in Britain. Of course, it was one of the most powerful countries on the planet at that date, and it's got representatives from everywhere living there, including from Ireland. The Irish, for what it's worth, were the single largest community of people born outside England and Wales, following which the Scottish, but far greater. The next largest group after them were those who were born elsewhere in the British Empire, particularly in India. And in Europe, the next largest group were the Russians, which may surprise you. Also, I'd like to draw your attention, when you do get your search results, you have 2 buttons on the right-hand side. You can click to see a transcript, or you can click to see an image. Be careful with your funds in this. And one trick I would advise you to do is hover over the transcript. See the button there for transcripts? If you hover over it, it'll tell you a little bit more about the transcript. It'll tell you, for example, the top item here, it gives the names of 2 other people who are in the household. So it allows you to narrow down even further before you commit to pay to actually look at an individual return. That's a useful way of actually trying to make sure you get what you're looking for. And for you're looking at the images, can I also draw your attention to the thumbnail strip that runs below your image? And also the series of buttons that include there, like thumbnails, extra materials, and so on. Click on the extra materials, because if you click on that, you'll see a bunch of additional pieces of information you may not immediately have realized were there. For example, you don't just get the front page of the return, you also get the back page of the return. And you also get the cover of the actual volume it's in, which can give you more information. It gives you 2 maps, as well as a description of the division of the area that this was recorded from. Well worth looking at all of them to get a good sense of the full value of the return. Also, can I draw your attention as well, on the search screen, there are a bunch of links here to learning more, search tips and useful links. Go and have a look at these. These have got a lot of information about some of the issues that I've been discussing here today. For example, the search tips will give you links through to information about the various different codes, occupation codes, and other codes that are used throughout the census. That can help you identify precisely what is being said, because the codes are often easier to read than the handwriting sometimes. Also, when you're looking at the census, bear in mind that you can use optional keywords. There's a search field which allows you to put in optional keywords. You can also use wildcards, asterisks, to replace a letter or a string of letters before or after a word. It works too. A location is also important. You can actually choose a location and you can search. You can see that little bar to the right hand side, the green bar. You can search out by 5 miles or 10 miles or so on to try and extend your radius without being too precise about the location you're looking at. These will all help you narrow down and get the results you want from the census. Now, I'll finish up here. I might take a few questions and we'll see what commentary there might be in the comments box. But just to finish up, if you're having any difficulty with the transcripts, there's an email address on the screen to reach out to our customer support team. And also, if you find any really cool things in your research, please let us know. We'd love to share it with a wider viewership as well, and with our rest of our customers and on our website. So pop any discoveries you find to discoveries at findmypast.com. And if this talk, or for that matter, using the site has inspired you to find your family story, please take advantage of this discount offer that we have on the screen. If you use the promo code ROADSHOW on the site, you can get a 21% discount off any 12-month pro subscription you take on the website. Now, thank you for listening, and I'll try and see if we've got a few questions here that I might be usefully be able to answer. I have to scroll back up your comments, there's been quite a few of them since I started, and see if there's anything here that I can actually help you out with. Oh, lots of comments about gloomy weather all over England. All I can say is in Dublin, it's glorious sunshine. We do take pleasure in that in Ireland. Sorry. um, Now, let's see what we have. My grandfather, let's have a look at this one. Here's an example. Let's see. My grandfather came from Anacotty, Limerick, but by 1921 had married my granny, and they were living in Anacon in Northumberland. I have found his siblings in Anacotty in the 1911 census of Ireland, I assume. But is it possible to find out where they were in 1921, given there wasn't a census? Oh, you're trying to find them in Ireland. Okay. Well, there's a number of sources you can actually go and look at. I'd recommend actually looking at some trades directories. Now, we have a number on our website you can go and look at, which is quite useful. You can also look at the various transcripts of parish registers we have on our site, which might help you determine what they were doing in 1921. And on top of that, can I just drag your attention as well to our petty sessions records? Now, nobody likes to hear that court records can be useful for your research, but petty sessions with the lowest court in the land, like your magistrates' courts in Britain today, they are essentially the same, or what we call district courts in Ireland now. And they all the most petty things, not just drunken disorderly behavior, but not getting your child registered after their birth or things like that, innocuous stuff which people could often fall foul of for no fault of their own. Have a look at that too. You never know what you might find. But you'll have to wait until the 1926 census comes out, which we'll be waiting for a few years. I tell you, it won't be until after 2026 anyway. Now I'm looking for the next question. Sorry, this will take a moment to read through these. A lot of questions about people struggling to find their Irish ancestors. I feel your pain. It can be really difficult. Um, Here we have another question. Let me show that to share it with everybody. My ancestors may have been Irish travellers. Their name was Smith, and I find them moving back and forth between East County Cork and mostly Wales and Glenmorgan. Where would Irish travellers be likely to show up in the UK? This was the early 19th century. Thanks in advance with any direction. Okay, that's a real conundrum. For those of you who don't know, travellers in Ireland are a minority ethnic group. Their origin stems from the medieval period anyway. It might even be earlier than that, but they have, for most of their history, they chose to have a migratory traveling or migratory lifestyle. They traveled throughout a series of predetermined places where they would actually ply a trade. It could have been in horse dealing, in tinsmithing, which was very common for them. It varies over time. But they're also enormously suspicious of anything to do with authority and the establishment, and they avoid it at all costs. And it's very difficult to actually find them, often even in civil records of birth, marriage, and death, they tended to not bother registering. So it can be very, very difficult. However, they were traditionally quite religious and quite determined to make sure that their important religious events like baptism and marriage were recorded. So I think you're going to need to focus on parish records. It's also worthwhile looking at security records, at police, court, and prison records, because they would be, when they were caught up by the security services, they were documented like everybody else. You can actually get a window into their lives there. May I also recommend contacting, there's a number of organizations in Ireland which specialize in traveller history. There's a group in Meath, who are the Meath Traveller Network, and there's also the Irish Folklore Archive, which is run out of the University College Dublin, which has quite a lot of information on travellers too. Let me see if we can find some more questions here. Now, here's an interesting one. Forgot to, oh, I think this is a previous comment. Forgot to say my Irish grandfather was a clockmaker to trade, and he met my granny when he came to mend the clock in the house where she was in service in Alnwick. This is the same case as we had before. I discovered so after my marriage that he mended the clocks on the farm my husband's granny came from, Aberwick Mill. Sadly, I didn't get to know my Irish grandfather since he died when my mum was only 8. So I would love to know if any of his nephews and nieces still live in Ireland. Well, I think I've told you what I know and you can do there. But I mean, forward genealogy is always complicated. I mean, it's one thing tracking people, families going back in time. Going forward can be difficult because you have to make a guesstimate as to when people might have got married and so on. I suppose it's not that much different. But where you're really going to have to focus in on is the civil register of births, marriages, and deaths. And, you know, that's just not available for the time period that you're looking for mostly. So I would recommend that you actually take a trip to Ireland and go through these records in person. Hopefully we'll get them online someday. That'd be great, wouldn't it? Yes, there's an interesting comment about wishing that we didn't refer to the famine in Ireland. And I totally understand that. It's a rather impassioned plea. Yes, there was no lack of food in Ireland. That's true. But the truth was the food available to those people wasn't available. That's the point. Horrific. Here we go. Another more questions here. Okay, got another example, another question here. I am the great, 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 great granddaughter of VOC Dutch East India merchants. May I ask how I find my past here in New York City? My maternal grandmother was the matriarch of the De Vaux family that hailed from Bruges, and my paternal grandfather was from the Royal Surgeons in World War One and World War Two. Well, I'd certainly say take your paternal grandfather. I would suggest you can actually trace him through the records and find my past very well. We have excellent military records, and I would strongly recommend that you actually go and try and see if you can track him down there. I'd say it would be very unusual if you didn't. That would be the route I would take. Now, I'm just having a look to see what other things we have here. Um, Lots of comments in here about difficulties of research and wanting to work out about how to do membership and so many. It's essentially. Okay, I think that takes me to the end of all the questions. Well, thank you very, very much for listening. I hope you continue to enjoy using the 1921 census and all of our fabulous records at Findmypast. We have the best record set for dealing with British and Irish ancestry by far. There's so many great utilities and tools there as well. So please keep enjoying using it, and I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much.